Hi, and thanks for
Hi,
coming
thanks and
back.
welcome
This is
back.
Natalie,
I'm happy to
and
meet
I
you
appreciate
today.
you joining me in my home studio today. I'm going to prep the fabric for today's lesson with a little bit of homemade starch. The recipe is available on the website at www.saturafabrics.com, and it's also in your workbook, which is a free download from the website as well. I'll put a link in the comments section below. So I've misted my fabric. It's quite saturated with the starch, and I'm going to press it or iron it with a dry iron, so no steam whatsoever, and I'll press it until the fabric is dry. Then it'll be nice and crisp and ready for sewing. In addition, you will need a few things from your sewing box. You'll need your buttonhole foot, which came with your machine, hopefully. It might not look like this, but hopefully you have one. And then I'm going to use a guide foot for when I'm doing my decorative stitches today, and an overcasting foot, a blind hem foot, which I don't have here, and a button stitching foot. As well, I'm going to use a few shirt buttons for a buttonhole sampler. And I'm going to make sure that I have a nice new needle on my machine so I don't wind up with any skipped stitches. If you have not watched the video yet about threads and threading, which is how to thread your machine and what kinds of threads to use, please go back to that one. So this is lesson 5, and the lessons do build on each other. In the bobbin, I have a sort of blue contrasting thread, and I'm going to do the same thing on the top. And the reason I've chosen to use contrasting thread is so that I can clearly see the stitches on my fabric and see if there's any mistakes as well. So that's really important. For today, I will need 4 pieces of fabric that are cut 7 inches by 2.5 inches, and 2 of those pieces have a selvage. So that's what I'm showing you here is the selvage. If you don't remember what a selvage is, please go back and review the video on textiles. So with the edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot, I've stitched 3 pieces together, and rather than have you watch me sew the same thing over and over again, I'll just do one demonstration for you. So with this, I've got the raw edges of the fabric, and I'm just pressing my seams open here for a minute, and I'm going to press them open with my fingers, and I'm going to add. So I've got this selvage edge, and I've got the raw edge, and I'm going to sew with raw edge to raw edge. So you can see kind of it's fuzzy, and with the raw edge to the raw edge, I'm going to sew. So here's how we do that. Draw my threads to the back of the machine. Start about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric, and back stitch about 2 to 3 stitches. Then I'm going to stitch forward with the edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot. There's a nice crisp shot of this photograph of this in your workbook, as well as detailed description. So this video is just to support the workbook. When you get to the end of the row of stitches, you'll back stitch again to lock in your stitches. So take 2 or 3 more back stitches and then trim your threads. That's how you sew a basic seam, edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot, and I have 3 of these finished. I'm pressing it open just with my fingers, so a quick little finger press to open up my seams. I'm going to do 3 seam finishes, and a seam finish is where I take the fuzzy edge that seems to be fraying and I do some kind of stitch to it to make sure that it doesn't fray. The first one I'm going to do is a basic zigzag, and you'll see what it looks like in a minute, but it's just a basic zigzag stitch. To do that, I take my fabric, just a single layer, and I push the other layers out of the way. You know what? Let me actually go ahead and do that a second time so you get it, because this is a novice video. So it's pressed open, take just 1 layer between my fingers, then push all the fabric out of the way. So I'm only sewing on 1 layer. With 1 layer of fabric, I turn my machine to the zigzag stitch, and I'm going to have a stitch width of about 2.5 and a stitch length of 3. And again, remember that you're using this video in conjunction with your free workbook. Once I finished sewing the zigzag stitch down both seam allowances, I sewed a straight stitch down the seam allowances of the next one, and I used my pinking shears. You'll see this in a minute. Now I'm switching to the overcasting foot, and I've got my overcasting foot on the machine, and I've got the edge of the fabric to the toe. So to the toe, it's not to the edge of the foot, it's to the toe of the foot. And you can actually see the fabric lining up with the toe. The overcasting foot has a little bar in it, and the machine is actually, the needle is passing back and forth over the bar and wrapping the thread around that raw edge where all the fraying may occur. And I'm just going to sew straight down the line, and I will wind up with a very nice, crisp, professional finish on my seam. See, just like the one you would see on a nice pair of sportswear from a good quality shop, and there are the other 2 seams. Zigzag, straight stitch, and pinked. And there are, of course, pictures in your workbook as well. Now I'm going to continue to practice the overcasting stitch because it really is one of the most important ones that you can use. If you don't have it, the other seam finishes are just fine. Zigzag and pinked and stitch will both work just as easily, because some people may be sewing on a machine that only has a straight stitch or a straight and a zigzag stitch, and that's just fine. Long before these fancy machines were made, people were sewing clothes. In fact, for millennia they did it by hand, so you could absolutely make beautiful clothes without a whole lot of fancy stitches. They're just nice to have. Once I finished sewing my seams, I'm going to finish the raw edges. So there's 2 edges that have the selvage and 2 edges that aren't finished to practice the overcasting stitch. Here I'm just going to make sure that I keep my fabric pointed in the right direction. And I need to trim a little bit there. That happens sometimes. And now I'm going to make sure they're pointed the same direction. Get any little threads out of there. I don't want the threads to go down into my machine, so I try to keep them trimmed as best as I can. And just keep sewing along with the edge of the fabric to the edge of the toe. And it's good to practice your overcasting stitch several times on your stitch sampler, because then when you go to make your first garments or your first home decor items, you'll already know how to finish those raw edges, and you'll have practiced a few times. So there you have it, complete and finished, the first sampler, 3 seam finishes. And you can go ahead and staple that in your book on the page that is marked seam finishes, and then it says, attached sample here. All right, so I'm switching out my presser foot, and I have a new piece of fabric. And with this fabric, I'm going to start sewing with the zigzag foot attached. I'm pulling the edge, the thread to the back of the machine. I try to remember to always do that. I'm simply going to sew a line of straight stitches, and this line of straight stitches will serve as a guide, like a fold line for my fabric. It makes it easier, and it doesn't necessarily add more bulk. Especially when you're a novice or a beginner, having that fold line can be very, very useful. So I've sewn along the edge with the edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot, and now I'm just using my fingers to finger press along that row of stitches. So, and then I'm going to fold it again. So I folded once, and then I'm going to fold it a second time. And that encases the raw edge. So just show it to you again. So here's the raw edge. I fold it once, and then I fold it again. And this is how you make a hem, a basic plain hem. So whether you're hemming some pants or a skirt or fixing a shirt or you're hemming some curtains, this is probably one of the most fundamental basics. So I'm sewing again with the edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot. You can see I'm just positioning the fabric there. And I've adjusted my location of my needle so that it's just catching the edge of the fabric. Don't look at where the needle is going. Keep your eyes focused on the edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot. The needle on the machine is going to go up and down, and it's going to form a line of stitches. So you don't have to look at it too often. Instead, focus on making sure that your machine sews neatly with the edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot. Remember to do your back stitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. Once I've got the straight stitch practiced a few times, and I've now made a plain hem with my straight stitch, the next stitch in your utility stitches is a basic zigzag as the straight stitch for knit fabrics. This is sometimes called an elastic stitch, a straight elastic stitch, a wobble stitch, and in the classroom I just call it the lightning stitch because to me, when you look at it on the stitch chart, it looks like a little bolt of lightning. At any rate, I've got my stitch width set to 1 and my stitch length is set to 4. And I'm going to stitch the lightning stitch, also called the elastic straight stitch or the straight stitch for knits. If you don't have this stitch, in a little bit I'll show you how to do something else instead. But this is just your basic straight stitch for elastic, and you're applying elastic to a waistband, some cuffs, or you're just sewing on knits, this is the stitch to go with. And good to practice all your stitches. So we're going to do a number of utility stitches today to ensure that you know how to operate your machine with each and every one of them. The next stitch we're going to do is a basic zigzag stitch. Just whatever your machine automatically sets to. And here I'm switching to the guide foot just because it's easier for me to see. It's sort of got really bold, bright red lines, and I can see it a lot more easily once I'm no longer on the edge of the fabric. So edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot works as if you're on the edge of the fabric, but once I get to the middle of the fabric, it's nice to have something bright to focus my eyes on. It's got nice big red lines that are easy to see. Here I've got my stitch length set to 3 and my stitch width set to 2.5 millimeters. And this is just your basic zigzag stitch. Testing your machine and seeing if it's going to stitch correctly. Now, what if it doesn't? What if your machine doesn't stitch correctly? Well, then there may be a problem with the threading, so double check your threading. You've already installed a new needle, so it can't be in the needle, and then the other thing it could be is your tension. If it's not the needle, the tension, or the threading, then your machine may need to go in for servicing. Those are the main possibilities. So check the needle, it's a brand new needle, you've checked that you threaded the machine correctly, and you've checked the tension. Now, what do I mean by checking the tension? Basically, what you have to do is you've got a top tension and a bottom tension on some machines. Some machines have an automatic bottom tension. And there's a little dial at the top of your machine that we went over when we talked about you and your machine. And you can turn that to the right and you can turn that to the left, and you can just play with it a little bit until you start getting nice stitches. So I've just sewn a row of triple zigzag stitch, and that is for when you're attaching an elastic waistband. So I said to you, if you didn't have the lightning stitch, you might have a triple stitch. And again, there's a chart of what I am talking about in your workbook, which is of course your free download. So lining my stitches up using the red line as my guide so that I have a nice even row of stitches. I'm going to practice the blind hem stitch. I'm going to stitch it out without the blind hem foot attached to the machine first so that I can make sure that my machine is stitching accurately. And then after I've got this stitched, I'll go ahead and switch out my presser foot from the guide foot that I have on here right now to the blind hem foot. And to practice a true blind hem, I'll need a separate piece of fabric. So I've got another piece of fabric here that is cut 7 inches by about 3 inches. And there is the blind hem foot. You can see it has a blade on it, and that blade is where I'm going to align the fold that I'm about to make in my fabric. So when you've switched out your presser foot to the blind hem foot, we'll practice doing a blind hem. So the first hem you practiced was the plain hem. That's just, you can see the stitches from the right side. So if you're walking around and your jeans have them, Dockers have them, some casual skirts have them, casual dresses have them. So you see this kind of top stitching mostly on casual wear up to office casual level. Professional apparel usually has, and evening wear usually has blind hems on them or invisible hems. So I've folded my fabric in half, and now I'm folding it again to leave myself a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And that fold is going to go against the blade. So what I've changed here on the machine is just the foot. I'm still sewing with the blade. So here it is again. I folded the fabric, and I'm going to just do it again because I think I didn't get a good shot of this. But here I folded the fabric again, and there's my 1/4 inch, and I've got my 1/4 inch right up against the blade of the foot. So I'm hoping you've seen that. I know it can be hard for novices to see how to do the blind hem. So you'll take your first couple stitches. I'm just using my hand wheel and turning it manually while I get my first couple stitches and make sure that I'm nicely aligned. Once I've got my alignment set up, then I can go ahead and start stitching. And what you'll see is that the machine will sew a couple of straight stitches, and then it will sew a nice little zigzag over to the left of the needle. So it'll go over the and make a little zigzag stitch. So a couple of straight stitches, then a couple of zigzag stitches. And there you have it. And I've sewn it with invisible thread. So there's your invisible seam that you would find on fine evening wear, professional apparel, completely invisible. And I'm going to attach that. So I've sewn it once, and I'm just showing you what it looks like if you didn't use matching thread. If you use contrasting thread, I just briefly showed you a sample I made earlier with contrasting thread. Now I'm going to go back to sewing my sampler, and for this I'm going to the next thing I'm going to do is, okay, so at this point I've just been playing with some of the stitches on my sewing machine, and just go ahead and pick any stitches that you want to practice. Stitch them out on your machine. And then I promised you earlier that when I would show you how to do another type of stitch. So just if you want to do an elastic stitch and you don't have the lightning bolt stitch, this is a simple zigzag that is about 1 millimeter, stitch width number 1 and stitch length number 4. And that'll replace the wobble stitch. It's not perfect, but it will do the job under most applications. So you'll still get that bit of movement if you're sewing knit fabrics. We're not there yet, but it's just something to practice and have on your stitch sampler. So at this point, I've sewn a bunch of different stitches. I've practiced the blind hem, the straight hem, some satin stitches on my machine, and I've just done a long line of zigzag stitches with a long narrow zigzag so that I can practice, you know, if I don't happen to have or I don't feel like doing the lightning stitch. Here I'm going to stitch out a last row of decorative stitches just to finish off my sampler, and once this is done, I'll consider my sampler done. So these are the basic utility stitches, and then I'm just throwing a little bit of decoration on here. If you don't have decorative stitches, it's not a big deal. They're not used very often anyways. The big thing to have practiced are the utility stitches. And I'm just, like I said, putting this here for decoration. So here's the whole sampler, and you can see all the different stitches that we've practiced today. They're in your workbook, but some of them aren't. The decorative ones aren't in your workbook, and they're just there for play. So it's good if you have them. That's great. There's your shell stitch, And oh no, that's not shell tuck stitch. That is actually, so I've got the blind hem stitch here, triple zigzag, zigzag stitch, the lightning bolt stitch, the straight stitch, which I use to form a hem at the edge of my fabric. And then that's basically the stitch sampler. And then at the other side of my sampler, I have a few decorative stitches, including a stitch that you can use to finish off the edge, which is either your shell tuck stitch or your edge joining stitch. You can use that to finish off the edge. So that is the basics. I also promised you in an earlier video, Threads and Threading, that I would show you how to use your reverse threading. So you've already threaded your machine in reverse. That's in Threads and Threading. I'm not going to show it to you again. But here it is. I've got my tension set to the minimum tension, and I'm going to stitch it out. And basically what I'm doing is I'm sewing a dart, and you don't know what that is yet, but this is the application. So here I am actually sewing with the reverse threading method. So bobbin threading method, reverse threading method, also called a mock chain stitch. And you can see here it is sewn, and then I'm going to take a pair of tweezers, and there's my row of stitches, nice and neat, right? I take a pair of tweezers and I just give it a quick tug, and presto, pretty much disappears. And so why would you want to do that? Because there are no pins on a factory floor. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you. If you've liked this video, or if you'd like to keep following along, please hit that subscribe button and that like button. And thanks again for joining me. I'm Natalie here in Memphis, Tennessee. Take good care of yourself. Happy sewing and stay safe.